So it was a couple of years ago, I guess, when inside my own organization, which is Ecomos, we were trying to up our game about engagement with climate change, and we quickly realized that, well, we could accomplish some things internally, that this was an issue where we needed partners and we needed unusual and new partners. And as I began casting about around the world for people to consult, people to collaborate with, I kept hearing about this Julie's bicycle. And it's, I guess, Alison, you might admit, a somewhat improbable name for an organization. And I came to understand that Julie's Bicycle, which is an NGO based in the United Kingdom, was at the forefront of looking at the cultural dimensions of climate change. And so, as quickly as I could, I navigated to the founding director of Julie's Bicycle, Alison Tickell, and it's been a pleasure to keep crossing paths with her on this climate and culture journey. And I think we're extraordinarily lucky that Alison has made the trip from the United Kingdom over to be with us today to be our closing speaker. Alison founded Julie's Bicycle in 2007 with the goal of helping the UK music industry reduce its environmental impact and develop new thinking in tune with global environmental challenges. And since then, Julie's Bicycle has grown into an international company covering performing arts, heritage, visual arts, and communities. I knew in particular about the great progress that Julie's Bicycle has made with the music industry on climate change issues, among others. But I didn't know until I read this bio, Alison, that you're trained as a cellist, and so a music ringer. So that explains some things. So as I said, I think we're quite lucky to have Alison with us today all the way across the Atlantic. And so please give a big welcome to the founder and director of Julie's Bicycle, Alison Tickell.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much for all our companionship over the last 2 or 3 years since we've met. And thank you all for being here. I am really, I know it's been said, but I am really honoured to be here today and to finish off what has been a quite staggering day of content and inspiration for me. And I can say really clearly now that nothing I say now you haven't already heard at some point today. So I've got the short straw. So it is a real joy to have the company of you, a community that is as committed and smart in your approach to this extraordinary issue around a climate and ecological crisis, as you all are. And I can say, after 12 years of working in this field very directly, that this is the most important work in the world. And I really believe that deeply. So much of what we're being called on to do today is the result of the unintended consequences of so much science. It sits at the heart of James Smithson's act of extraordinary generosity, a man who had never trodden on US soil, bequeathing his fortune to this country because he understood that utilitarian and egalitarian public science would flourish better here than in stuffy and conservative England. Believe me. He believed that, and I quote, "It is in his knowledge that man has found his greatness and his happiness, the high superiority which he holds over the other animals who inhabit the earth with him." In large part, and I'm very sad to say this, his sentiment still holds in far too many places. And herein lies the sting. His sentiment perfectly captures the unchallenged assumption of the supremacy and legitimacy of an extractive, solely materialist and largely masculine ideology brought here by Europeans. And you guys are an enormously influential country now, as you know. We all know, and it's been said many, many times today, that the climate crisis, and incidentally, I don't talk about climate change. I talk about the climate crisis. That's one of those reframings that I have learnt is actually quite a critical reframing. But we all know that the climate crisis is a cultural crisis, that the myths and the stories that we hold so dear and that we tell ourselves repeatedly on a daily, minute-by-minute basis are rooted in those often well-intended values that held by the likes of James Smithson, values that are wrong as they are strong. Our understanding of nature is deeply and profoundly cultural. I think we've heard that again and again today. The idea of nature and the idea of culture work so closely together. They are almost one and the same, and science seeks to explain it all in simple ways. A piece of work done by a great guy, Jeremy Lent, took the metaphors of science, and I've overlaid them with the metaphors of culture. And we have nature as a machine. It's a hostile agent. It is to be dominant. And we have exactly the same kinds of parallel narratives around culture. Culture is an engine of growth. We've heard that in the UK. We're always talking about the creative industries being the vector for growth. A pinnacle of our achievement, that what we do with culture is the best of what we have to offer. And it is nature transcendent. It is taking nature and making it better. And similarly, we are very rarely thinking of averting those ideas. Nature as a giving parent, a web of life, a teacher. Could we also take on some of those responsibilities? Could we be a creative child, an ecosystem, a learner? And we have the same with framing, and this is, I think, what Nicole was talking about just now. Nature has no intrinsic value. It should be conquered, exploited, engineered, bought, and sold. Similarly, culture can conquer the world. It will drive economic growth. Artistic priorities are supreme. They beat everything else. And that we can buy, own, exploit, and sell natural resources, all in the name of art. Can we turn this over and say that everything is connected? That humans are a part of nature, that the earth is a holistic living organism, and that earth is creative beyond our restricted and constrained imaginations as Homo sapiens. And humans, we have much to learn. And similarly with culture. Culture is reliant, as we know, on a thriving world. We've heard so much around the risks to cultural as a consequence of the climate crisis. It is tangible and intangible heritage. It is dependent on the earth, and we have much to learn from nature. It really is high time that we inverted nature and culture and put culture back where it needs to be, which is subject to nature. It is a category of nature, not its master. After all, the climate crisis is nature's version of interrupting these pernicious myths and frames. Culture can and must interrupt alongside. So I'm a beginner to much of what you've been talking about today. It's only in the last few years that I've discovered the likes of Suzanne Simard, much of the ecology that you've been talking about today, people like Robin Wall-Kimmerer, Isabel, Janine. I've heard some fantastic people today. The interconnectivity, the reciprocity, the cognition and the interdependence within everything. Cultural heritage is where it's at, and you, friends sitting here now, are creating rich and messy landscapes of knowledge to replace the super-directional highway that has led us to so much loss. This is in large part why 12 years ago I founded Julie's Bicycle. Why the arts and the creative communities are so important, they are so critical to everything that we do now, and I'm so grateful to be speaking to you all today. Our frame is quite wide, so I'll tell you more about the parts of the sectors that we work with. But if we take the whole of the creative community, we include in it design, absolutely fundamental. Everything that we have around us is a product of a designer somewhere. We need to bring designers in on a completely different level. Advertising, we're being sold all the time. We are being sold. We're taught to desire things that we can't get. And then when we get them, we're being taught to desire more. Publishing, film, gaming, fashion, which has the second largest environmental impact of anything other than oil and gas. Literature, music, the performing, the visual arts, galleries, and museums already massively impact daily life. They taste make, they lifestyle, and they enable us to feel deeply. They bring us together in communities of practice, and they touch a different way of knowing, which is so critical that we start to inhabit. And I think that they should now all be repurposed to serve this emergency. So, Julie's Bicycle, we have a very simple idea of that actually we just need to serve creative climate action. We've always understood that that creativity and culture really can power change in a different way. We are not technocratic, we're not scientific, we're not political beings only. The human being is a really interesting animal, and we are moved by things far beyond what we understand as the leverage, the levers of society. And we've felt always at Julie's Bicycle that if we change culture, culture changes the world. It's as simple as that. But culture, we need, as a community of practice, we need profoundly to change. And there's an awful lot more that we need to do. So 12 years ago, when I set Julie's Bicycle up, we were rooted in the music industry, an industry that was very happy with gestural politics. Didn't have a tradition of taking responsibility for its own impacts in how it does. So we recognised that actually the narratives alone weren't enough. We had to embody change differently. And that meant doing. It meant using our bodies to start to inhabit a different way of thinking about and shaping the world around us. My thinking has really evolved over the last 12 years, actually, and I'm just going to run through how we approached this challenge, the naivety that sat at the heart of it. That can sometimes be a good thing, and how it's changed into a much more complex approach. So we started with metrics. Sorry, those are our objectives. Cultural activities are restorative and net zero, carbon and culture inspires action on the climate and ecological crisis. The language has changed, it's updated itself, but actually those two objectives haven't changed at all. And I think it's important for us to recognise now that we are in a systemic situation. So Julie's Bicycle has never done one thing. We've never taken a single issue and followed it through, because that is not how this thing is working. The climate crisis is a super wicked problem, and we need to think really comprehensively, really creatively about how we shift it. And that means that if we're going to make systemic change happen, we have to work within a system, which means more than one thing at once. But we started with the metrics, thinking that we could start and there would be a very clear pathway of change. And in my naive way, I thought, God, if people know about climate change, all they're going to want to do is to change what they do. And of course, that wasn't the case. However, metrics have been really, really useful to us. So the first thing we did was to carbon footprint in 2007 the UK music industry. And we worked with Oxford University, and we gathered together 200 key players from the UK music industry who literally gave us their electricity bills and gas bills and diesel bills and all of that. And out of that, we created a carbon footprint of the music industry, and it has been prodigiously helpful. What it's done is to enable us to develop over time, co-curating with our industries, a set of free to use, and that's really important, environmental impact tools, which we called the Creative Green tools. What they will do for all our cultural activities, which include buildings, festivals, productions, events, touring, travel, the movement of art and artworks, and audience travel, what they do is provide you with a snapshot of your environmental impacts over time. And all of them have been developed with and by those communities. So we learned that it's very important that people see themselves in all of this, and that there are some specifics around our world that need to be recognised. The large movement of people, for example, at certain events. Touring is very specific to the creative industries. What do we do about touring? How can we model a touring tool that's going to speak to people? And this is an area of huge concern at the moment. But the idea of co-curation is both means that you're going to get a much more accurate idea of your impacts, but also you're going to build a critical mass of literacy and of engagement in the topic. These Creative Green tools have been really helpful for us. We've been working with them for over a decade. There are now 5,000 organisations registered on them, producing live feedback every year. 50 countries, 40% of them are international, and that for me is really interesting. It seems that people are seeking to discover how they can really make change. The results, very simply, are we have an international carbon data set for culture, which is incredibly helpful. It allows us to understand ourselves in relation to others, both other countries, other territories, other activities. We've included value metrics beyond carbon, which includes well-being, commissioning, campaigning, governance structures that you might have in your institutions. We've developed a very rich library of guides and resources to support people, and we have this 4,500 plus organisations actively tracking and managing their environmental impacts. The second principle that we've taken is the idea of growth. So the point about metrics, by the way, is data gets a hard time a lot of the time. People are quite anti-data too often. And what that data means to us, it's an accountability trail to in the context of the climate crisis. If we know what our impacts are, not only are we able to track them against targets, but we also have found that that piece of literacy is incredibly enabling wherever you are, because you start to look at the world in a different way. The second area that we've covered is growing knowledge. And this is critical in terms of co-creation, and this is why the work of this group is so important, that we share, we combine, and we together develop a much richer knowledge base. So over the years, and very much in partnership with all the people that we're working with, we, on the basis of a research brief that we continually repeat, we've developed resources, networks, events right across the piece, and we're now working pretty internationally on all of that. Our ethos for that is, if somebody wants to take action, we need to help them to do it, whatever that takes. So we have resources on waste, on water, on the circular economy, on biodiversity in buildings, on science-based targets, on energy management, on festival practice, on audience campaigns, on communications, whatever it is, so that if there is that little spark of energy, there's somewhere to go and some support. That has led to this incredible and really exciting diversity around taking action. We have an enormous number of people who are taking action all over, particularly the UK, and there is a specific reason for that, which I'll come on to in a minute. But we steward a range of different actions. We have something called the Creative Green Programme, and it's based on, again, going back to what Nicole was saying, very similar kinds of approaches. It's based on the idea that there are three key areas that we need to look at very quickly. It's a sort of growth model. One is commitment. What does action look like in your organisations or with your people around governance? Do you have a board member with responsibility for the climate crisis? Do you have policies? Do you put sustainability into your job descriptions? Do you look at investment, where you've invested your endowments or your fossil? What is your relationship to fossil fuels? Communication, you need to talk all the time internally to broaden the conversation, and you need to inspire. The second area is understanding. There's no point in getting involved in this unless you know what you're talking about. So do you understand your impact areas? What are you learning about them? What insights can you bring to the field and the wider field? How can you share what you learn? And secondly, do you evaluate? Do you progress? Do you extend your ambition? And finally, improvement. And we've seen a surge of people using green energy, renewable energy. What does that look like? Can you track change over time to help others on these pathways? And we also have a certification scheme, which actually really helps, because if you make it competitive, it brings out sometimes the best in people. The day we added stars to our certification was a day which saw it go up. We also award people, and I think it is really important to celebrate and really reinforce leadership practice. And we're working with many organisations across the UK and actually increasingly internationally to either adopt that framework or to adapt it, take it. This is all there to be taken. If we've learned anything, it is that generosity needs to sit at the heart of this, and a mutual respect for learning. So we are making this as accessible as we can. And we're working, I suppose, with about over 100 major institutions on this particular programme at the moment. That's the certification. So a pivot moment came for us in 2012. We were founded the year before the UK put into law our Climate Change Act. We were the first country in the world to have a Climate Change Act. And we were founded the year before. And in 2012, a few years afterwards, after a lot of lobbying, not just from us, but from many artists and organisations in this space, we persuaded our national funding body, the Arts Council of England, responsible for distributing annually to over 800 organisations, about the equivalent of $900 million. So a very strategic body, and we persuaded them that the environmental crisis needed to sit in their policy framework. And so since that time, the Arts Council has made it a requirement for their funded bodies to, first of all, fill out a Creative Green tool, which means that every single organisation has to have a carbon footprint annually. The second thing they did was require every organisation to have an environmental policy written and submitted. And the third thing they did was to require everybody to have an action plan. And they pegged this to funding. That was the game changer. It wasn't what they were asking people to do, it was what they were telling people to do. And Julie's Bicycle provided a rich collection of resources, of events, of conversations, a helpline, fact sheets, mythbusters, and a lot of celebration to support people on that journey. And it's been astonishing. We're now into our 7th year of that programme, and it has changed everything. The most recent, I'll go through some of the changes, but this came out 2 weeks ago or so, and I'm just going to let you watch it. So what were the results? So what we've identified during that programme is that we actually have had some stunning results, not by asking anybody to do anything except for to report. And I think that's very, very important. What's under that is asking people to become, or requiring people to become climate literate. And what we found is that 23% of our organisations decreased their energy. We didn't ask them to do anything, just to report. 35% decrease in energy use emissions based on electricity and gas, and a 7% annual reduction in energy use emissions since 2012 to 13. Nobody was asked to reduce. We also found significant increasing of resilience. £16.5 million was saved just by filling in a carbon footprint. Go back to that. And 75% of organisations were able to generate further funds as a consequence of talking about this work. 64% of organisations are getting rid of single-use plastic. 54% have installed energy-efficient lighting and controls. 70% actively promote virtual communications technologies as alternatives to travelling. That's really important. That's a hard one. and 49% have produced, programmed or curated work exploring environmental themes. That last one is very important because many times over the years I've been asked, why aren't you missing the point? Why aren't you talking about the content? And our theory of change is going back to this idea of embodiment. If you don't do it, if you don't understand what it really means in an active way, you lose the integrity of the work. And the two are like this. So that was really, really important to me. So, the last bit, new skills and knowledge, clean technologies, goods and services, solutions, and the circular economy is where we're heading. All of this is signs of a new creative ecology, which is really the holy grail of this. 78%, that's nearly 80%, now include sustainability in their core business strategies. 38% have a director or board level representative with an environmental remit. 47% are trialling sustainable productions, and 29% have an ethical sponsorship or partnerships policy, and that latter one is growing rapidly. I suspect we did that survey about 9 months ago. I suspect that will have changed because the climate crisis has become very political in the UK. So what next? We're now in the last 4 years of this programme with the Arts Council. And what's been really, really delicious is seeing how much more ambition the Arts Council itself has had. We've been a bit of a sort of, something to sort of slightly hide away. We've just been charging on, but it's like the environmental programme, because it's been a difficult space and it asks very hard questions of us. But over the last year or so, the Arts Council has become very ambitious. And what we're doing now is the Spotlight programme, which I think is potentially another game changer. It's working with organisations within the Arts Council that are in receipt of over £1 million, who represent about 60% of the footprint. And we are working very closely with 30 of those 60 organisations on science-based target setting. That means working with them to develop a pathway between where they are now and where they need to be in order to reach a net zero cultural proposition. And this is a very new piece of work. It's really exciting. It's really challenging, because there is so much around it that we don't know, and we're having to make lots of assumptions, but it is extremely exciting. And we're finding more and more organisations are coming to say, tell us about how to make science-based targets work for us. We've got an accelerator programme which is around real innovation. We're working with 20 organisations or clusters of organisations, completely reframing what it is to be an arts organisation. What is a community? What is stewardship? And they range from becoming a totally circular organisation, a circular economy organisation, to being an organisation that is going to ban travel altogether. So these are very, very exciting, pioneering pieces of work. And we've got a museums framework. It's 2017, and actually after today, I just think we need badly to update it because there's so much exciting practice. But that's telling you what environmental compliancy needs to look like, what's good, what's very good, and what's best practice. Finally, there's creative connections. Now, this is where I think I've done the most learning. All of that work that we've been doing has really been focused on how can we get our own house in order. But of course, as we've heard again and again today, climate is far wider than our immediate impacts. It requires us to think very differently about everything that we do and who we are. And actually, it's all about making connections. 2 years ago, we thought we would trial a project in the build-up to the COP talks. It was actually 2018's COP talks. And we would invite organisations all over the country and artists all over the country to celebrate the environment and to commission work on climate change or to accelerate the work that to celebrate the work that they were doing in their organisations. It was unfunded, so we just set up a little website and we worked with partners. And it was called The Season for Change. And we found that 112 brand new commissions were made as a consequence of that invitation, and well over 2 million people took part in it, which absolutely amazed us. As a consequence, we've now been given some funding by our Arts Council to do it again for 2020. And we launched it perhaps 2-3 weeks ago. We've already got almost 500 organisations committing to do new commissioning in the run-up to the COP that we're having in Glasgow in November. And there's calls to make it an international moment. So this is an invitation to you to join in the Season for Change. Just register yourselves on the website, and you will find that that there are many other organisations and artists doing stuff, and we've got a toolkit to support action. This is all taking us towards policy, and policy's been mentioned a few times today. And one of the things about the Arts Council programme was a recognition that policy matters so much, because policy is that lever that just unlocks a completely different approach to this, where requirements, compliancy, force change. And I think we're in this space. So we've been looking very closely at what I call now eco-cultural policy, because cultural policy is undoubtedly broken. Globally, cultural policy is broken. You do not see the climate crisis recognised in policy frameworks to anything like the degree that is required. You do not see cultural policy makers thinking, what is this going to take for us? What do we need to do to adjust to change? There's nothing in the creative, there will be in Europe, but there's nothing in the Creative Europe policy frameworks. There's nothing yet in the IPCC, as Andrew has been fighting valiantly with Marcy Rockman to make sure that the IPCC recognises culture. There is nothing there. There is very little in the UN framework. There is nothing there that is going to make this thing work, and we have to put it there. So we've been doing a lot of work learning from the Arts Council's programme, but also we've been doing a lot of work in cities, and we are doing a lot of work in cities with many partners to advocate for policy to be the driver for culture. Policy is going to be broken unless the climate and ecological crisis become the vector for which, the constraints around which we make policy. We're doing policy with world cities, several in the States. San Francisco has done some really lovely, really interesting work. We've got Julianne Polanco to talk about that. We've been doing some work with New York, and we're doing work with 14 other, sorry, and I need to hurry up, so I'll hurry up a bit, with 14 other cities. Finally, what we've been looking at is what constitutes a movement, because this is all about movement building. We need to come together and we need to take action, because it is not enough just to do the internal stuff. What are the profound adjustments we need to make to survive? And we had a summit last week at the National Geographic Society in London. And to paraphrase Frances Morris, who is the chief executive of Tate Modern, and she steered the Tate Declaration of Climate and Ecological Emergency, she said, we have, and this is a brave thing for her to say, she said, we have too many exhibitions, too many acquisitions, too many loans, too many spaces, too many creative individuals, and too much privilege. We have too little outreach, too little social practice, too little leadership, too little participation, too little co-production, too little family, too little creative learning, and too little making. She's looking into the heart of the beast. So what is a movement? We've done some work looking at what's happened globally. We did a creative climate census. We have all the frameworks we need for action. We have the donut economic model. If you haven't read Kate Raworth, I cannot recommend her highly enough. We have the circular economy. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. We have 1.5 in Paris. And we have the 9 planetary boundaries. Where on earth is culture in that? We need to take that space. We found in our work that that climate action is happening all over the world in the most exciting, creative way, like fireflies. Creative ideas are everywhere. They are uncovering mycorrhizal networks that bind culture to energy, to finance, to the circular economy, and to nature, alongside climate justice, placemaking, and the economy. And I'm going to whiz through these. They are pathfinding organizations, individuals, again, like many in this room, who are creating new ways of thinking about this. There's the artwork. There's no shortage of artwork. It has become the muse of our time. Activism, again, we don't need to talk about activism. Although I do want to stop very briefly. We have Music Declares an Emergency in the UK. JB partly founded that. Within 5 days, we had 1,500 people signing up to that, from the 1975 right through to Billie Eilish. We have Culture Declares, that top one. We have Heritage Declares, and we have Architects Declare. And these have become these fantastic vectors of urgent and impatient action. And I urge you to think about declaring a climate and ecological emergency, because they really work in terms of community building. And justice. They also create spaces for climate justice in a different way. And I think, you know, somebody who looks and sounds like me, we really need to take this on. It's been said several times today. Organizations who are leading change. I think organizations embody culture in a different way. They are the unsung leadership models. We embody our values in a different way, and we really need to get out there and talk about it. Design and innovation, I've spoken a bit about, and we need to collaborate, and we need to policy change. These will strengthen the movement. The last thing I just quickly want to say is that this movement, we need a global network of artists and cultural leaders, because what's been happening is that climate change is invigorating cultural change, and climate justice is invigorating cultural justice. And we do need to ask ourselves what cultural justice needs to look like. We run creative climate leadership courses. In fact, we were rather hoping to get Janine to the one that I'm about to do in Arizona, but she was not able to come. But some of the people that we've been working with, giving them that leadership, that companionship, that space to be the pioneers, the pathfinders that they are, have resulted in things like Culture Declares an Emergency. People are very lonely, people are very on their own out there, and our job is to gather them and to help them to thrive, because they are the people who are making change. And we need to ask ourselves, how can we make this global network of artists and cultural leaders really thrive? So, a chemist himself, looping back to the beginning, a chemist himself, James Smithson, said of chemistry, it was a science consisting of isolated points, thinly scattered like lurid specks on a vast field of blackness. But I think, were he to give his money to this today, he would say the absolute opposite, because the frontier of science is here today in this room. It's the same frontier of culture. It's an appreciation of unimaginable connectivity. And in these strange times, you here are managing to keep hold of cultural truths which never lost their mooring. The arts and the creative community are at last doing the same. It's taken quite a long time. I don't think it's a coincidence that the most environmental and cultural activists I meet are people who have been really taken by this with as much wit and wisdom as you would expect. We have this year, and a once-in-a-generation event at the end of it, COP26 in Glasgow. We can affect so much that happens during and after the first 2 weeks of November in 2020. This is the clarion call to adjust to this new world with Mother Earth. This call is absolute. In the UK, we have 13% of our land left wild, one of the most nature-depleted countries on Earth. And wilding has become of the utmost urgency as our natural heritage plunges. It's a desperate place for us. We need to rewild everything, our land, our built environment, and especially we need to rewild our brains. And if any community can do that, it's the arts and culture. I'm going to leave you with a quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who I'm absolutely in love with. And she says, "The rocks are beyond slow, beyond strong, and yet yielding to a soft green breath, as powerful as a glacier. The moss is wearing away their surfaces, grain by grain, bringing them slowly back to sand." Thank you.
Well, brava, thank you. Alison, what an excellent summation and way to close out our program. I have been asked to make some concluding remarks and to try a bit to summarize what we've heard. It's occurring to me now this is quite a thankless, if not impossible, task. I am a policy lawyer, and so the risk of us going from the sublime to the prosaic in record speed is very real. I'd actually be quite content to cede my time back to the earlier speakers, but I have been given an assignment to deliver some specific instructions regarding the breakout sessions tomorrow, and so I'm going to press forward, and I also want to make a special welcome, a special hello to the people watching on live streaming, and especially to those of you who may be many time zones away and are thus in the wee hours of your tomorrow morning. I think to end, it's useful to go back to the beginning and recall what was said in the announcement of this symposium. What were we meant to be talking about according to that announcement? What it promised was that we would spend our day here together, essentially doing two things. One, examining the impact of climate change on communities and their cultural heritage. And two, discussing the opportunities to leverage cultural heritage for climate action. And it said we'd pay special attention to the responsibilities of those who are stewards of cultural heritage. And my goodness, I think this promise has been very richly fulfilled. I really stand in awe of the speakers that we have heard from and the exceptional work that they are doing. And that makes it all the more ironic that indeed one of our principal projects here today is to transcend the exceptionality of the presentations that we've heard, which is to say, to make the unusual usual, to make climate change a usual part of the practice of cultural heritage, and to make cultural heritage a usual part of climate action. And so the question is how? How do we accomplish that? How do we make progress? And it perhaps doesn't need to be repeated, but I am going to repeat that all of this is unfolding in a moment of urgency. We heard from Ken and others about the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees warming, which established that in order for us to have just a decent chance of limiting global warming to arguably manageable levels, we needed rapid and far-reaching transition in every sector. Rapid and far-reaching transition in every sector. And so I want to ask you, do you feel like we're engaged in rapid and far-reaching transition in the cultural heritage sector, in the way we practice cultural heritage and the way our institutions work? My worry is that the work of the speakers that we've heard from today is not the rule among our colleagues, and it needs to be. Not enough people are doing the kind of work we've heard about. Many of you in this room are, but how about your colleagues? How about peer institutions? And so the question for this symposium is, how do we accelerate the engagement of cultural heritage in the cultural heritage field on the topic of climate action? And how do we do it at a scale that is commensurate with what the science tells us is required? And that's going to be essentially the focus of our breakout sessions tomorrow. And I'll just make a housekeeping announcement in the middle of my talk to say that there has been a sort of careful curation of tomorrow's breakout sessions. And so each of you that signed up has been assigned a destination. It's indicated on your name badge. The registration email that you received gave you specialized information about how to get to the site of your breakout session, because in most cases they will be happening in institutions that won't be open to the public at the moment you arrive, and so you need to follow those instructions. So please go to the session that you signed up for and follow the instructions on how to get there. But once you do get there, what we're going to try to do is ask you to work collectively to identify practical solutions, key opportunities, and challenges for mobilizing the cultural heritage sector for climate action. And even if you aren't joining one of the breakout sessions, we hope these questions will be on your mind as well. So I'm going to try to quickly share a few thoughts about how to go about that work tomorrow, drawing on the presentations that we heard from over the course of the day. The key word for all this is action, climate action. How do we mobilize cultural heritage for climate action? And it's useful, I think, to have a communal understanding of what is meant by climate action. We heard amazing examples of it from all of our speakers, and I'm again, in my prosaic, lawyerly way, going to attempt to give a little bit of a framework for thinking about that, and I'm drawing this from the Paris Agreement and from the ICOMOS Future of Our Past report. The Future of Our Past report found that there are significant cultural heritage dimensions to every aspect of climate action covered by the Paris Agreement. And so what are those? 1, enhancing adaptive capacity, adaptation. 2, mitigating climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, so mitigation, greenhouse gas reduction. 3, planning for loss and damage. And 4, building ambition and capacity in communities to deal with climate change. And so I think it would be useful if you keep these concepts in mind: adaptation, mitigation, planning for loss and damage, and building capacity and ambition. As you benchmark and think about what contributions you can make to climate action, your institution can make. What are the things that you're good at, that you know how to do, that could be useful to taking these forward? And so I'm going to say just briefly a minute about each of those 4 categories. First, adaptation. We know from the IPCC report that humans have already warmed the planet 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times, so we've already changed the climate. And we're not going to be able to undo that anytime soon, and so we need to adapt to the change that we've already caused. And that means adapting to rapid onset events, but also to slow onset events. It means adapting to displacement. It means adapting to secondary effects like increased migration and conflict. And we heard so many examples of the way cultural heritage is contributing to community adaptation here today, from the hydraulic lift at Farnsworth House that Ashley mentioned, to the reconceptualization of the Anthropocene that Nicole mentioned, to the sustenance we get from cultural communities that Victoria highlighted, and so many other examples. The recovery of memory in dunes as community adaptation that Isabel talked about. So how can you contribute to adaptation? How can your institution do that? So adaptation. Second, mitigation. Unfortunately, we're continuing to emit net greenhouse gases. So we're continuing to warm the planet beyond what we already have done. The IPCC, the climate science, tells us that the more we warm the planet, the worse the impacts get and the less successful adaptation is likely to be. So we need to arrest that warming. The Paris Agreement provides a plan for doing that, for holding global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius through decarbonization, changing the ways that we grow food and transport and build cities and design cities and the like. And so how do we contribute to that process? What is the contribution of cultural heritage to decarbonization? And again, we heard so many examples today. That missing cupola that Ashley mentioned, that traditional knowledge of how to build buildings in a low carbon way, from that to the avoided carbon and retrofitting that Carl talked about, to the ethos of living in planetary boundaries and sustainable consumption and production that Janine described, to the reframing that Alison talked about, all these different ways that cultural heritage contributes to mitigation. And so that's a second question for you tomorrow. How do we contribute to that? Loss and damage. We know every system has a limit to its adaptive capacity, and we are exceeding those limits across the planet. And so we will lose heritage, we will lose values, we will lose attributes of values, we will lose heritage sites. We're not very good in our world about planning to lose things. It's antithetical to what we're about, but it's inevitable in this case. And so how do we plan for loss and damage? How do we help communities cope with loss and damage? How do we minimize the effects of loss? We heard a lot about that from Victoria and the methods she described, the resilience that Janine described in the face of staggering loss, the coming to grips with impermanence that Isabel talked about. So what is our contribution to helping communities contend with loss and damage? And then finally, building ambition and capacity in communities to deal with climate change. And Nicole talked a lot about that, and so many of her remarks are pertinent. I like the observation Ashley made about incorporating stories of climate change into site interpretation and visitor experience, and there were a host of examples given. And so the question is, what do you feel like you can bring to that conversation? What are possibilities and limits to how you can contribute to building ambition and capacity in communities? And so I think I won't take any more time to try to summarize the remarks that we heard this morning, this afternoon. They were so rich, but only to say that there is a framework, a policy framework that you can use, these 4 categories, and to help you benchmark where you're landing in the climate scape. I might just lastly mention the topic of equity. Almost all of our speakers mentioned the topic of equity and justice, and it is omnipresent in climate action. We heard that communities that are on the front lines of climate impacts often contribute the least greenhouse gas emissions, so there's an injustice present there. And so how do we show solidarity to communities on the front lines of climate action? How do we decide in an era of limited budgets whose heritage is valued, whose stories are taken account of, whose heritage gets saved and whose doesn't? It's a question of equity. How do we avoid magnifying existing injustice in the way the cultural heritage community responds to the climate crisis? And also just transition. The communities whose traditional livelihoods, whose jobs will be affected by these transitions, how do we tell their stories and value their contribution in the process? And so I think it's an important lens to keep in mind tomorrow also, this question of justice. How will we proceed after tomorrow, next week, and the following week? Together is the answer. Alison described initiatives around the world to mobilize cultural voices for climate action, and I'd like to add to that a mention of the Climate Heritage Network, which you've heard about a bit already today. The Climate Heritage Network is a free voluntary network of arts, culture, and heritage, units of government, universities, businesses, NGOs that want to help mobilize cultural heritage for climate action and realize the potential of cultural heritage. We're a network of networks from all different sectors of arts, culture, and heritage. So I invite you to look at www.climateheritage.org and consider your institution for membership in the network. And so just to conclude, we've heard from Ken and others that we must collectively rise to the climate change challenge. Our world has an emissions gap. We're not on track to meet the Paris Agreement. And clearly behind that emissions gap is an ambitions gap. But we've been working on climate change for 20, 30 years. I mean, there's the fatigue Nicole talked about, that we've heard about climate change for so long. How could we have made so little progress? What haven't we tried? Haven't we tried everything? Well, no, we haven't tried everything. What's missing from the climate change toolkit, from the policy table? We have been missing. Arts and culture and heritage, we have been missing from the equation. And so perhaps we are part of the missing link. We are part of the solution to closing the ambitions gap and closing the emissions gap. And so I leave you just with the idea that cultural heritage is a climate change issue. Climate change is a heritage issue. We need to work together, mobilize arts, culture, and heritage, close the ambition gap, and close the emissions gap. And so with that, I thank you for your attention. I thank you for your passion. I thank you for your participation. And it is my delight to hand the dais back over to the impresario of this entire of the moving day, Amber Kerr from the Smithsonian. Amber?
So 2 years ago, the IIC approached Sam about this idea of a dialogue. this idea about a dialogue of climate change and its effect on cultural heritage. And at the time, I was so excited at the idea of being able to give an opportunity to raise awareness to this. But I myself knew very little, really. I mean, aside from what I was hearing in the news or hearing from my colleagues and understanding the importance of sustainability in the things that I do as a paintings conservator and the interactions I have within my museum and the responsibilities I was hearing that would be good for us to do as best practices to mitigate the risks that were involved for my museum or my collections. But I also began to realize there was so much more to it. And then there was this day where a friend called up and said, hey, I have some friends in town who want to go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Can't get tickets. Can you get us in, Amber? You work at the Smithsonian. And yes, I could. And so I met them. And it was that serendipitous moment when I met Andrew Potts. And in a sidewalk conversation between showing them the Lunder Conservation Center and talking about what I do as a conservator and walking over to NMAC, that I found out I had something in common with this person I had just met. And at that point, Andrew was transitioning and getting ready, leaving his position as a lawyer full-time and taking on this incredible challenge of climate change and cultural heritage and climate action. And he had been moved so much by what he had been exposed of through the years that he in his lawyer work and with Ecomus, that this was his passion, and I could hear it in his voice. And then I said, well, let's do lunch. And we did, and we spoke. And I realized there was so much more than just what an evening program for the public could do. And I realized that, like myself, there were probably many other colleagues out there who needed to know more, who needed to hear more, who needed to hear what was going on. And then I learned within my own institution about the Earth Optimism movement and this idea of you just feel so encumbered by all the news that you hear about the climate change and climate action and what's going on. And sometimes you don't know where to begin. But we need to find those pathways. And it's then when we had our lunch and we had our conversation since then that this day came about and tomorrow came about. And as Andrew has pointed out these things to talk about tomorrow, as I mentioned to you, you are not just attendees. We really need you to bring your stories, your interests, your questions, which are so important to the conversations tomorrow. We don't expect you to have answers. But we know you've got these incredible creative minds. And that I think when we come together and we talk about today and the things we've heard and the things that other sectors are doing, that we might be able to learn from these experiences and together have a conversation that's going to help a movement forward. Even if there are small steps, we're going to build that bridge that was talked about by Ken Kimmel this morning, together as a cultural community. And it is time for us to truly step up. And I'm so proud of everyone in this room and everyone online who's been listening today and these incredible speakers. I mean, I am just completely blown away by today. I don't know about the rest of you. Are the rest of you pretty blown away? I mean, holy cow. One of those moments. I am in awe right now, and there's a lot to digest. And there was a reason why we didn't plan anything for tonight. Because part of that homework that Victoria spoke about, and I loved our homework assignment, but part of that homework is for you to go out, have drinks, talk about today. Talk about the things you learned, talk about the things you've experienced, think about it, and then tomorrow we hope you come feeling charged, empowered, wanting to talk, wanting to learn more, wanting to find ways of becoming involved and really moving forward. And at the end of the day tomorrow, when you've talked and you've worked on these things and we identify where we are, where we need to be, and how we're going to get there, just in our conversations, come back tomorrow night and join us for that dialogue that started this whole conversation and really evolved into the events today and tomorrow, where we are going to open these doors and we're going to have our visitors and public come in here along with all of you who are willing to come, and we do hope as many of you can come as possible. Share the word with friends of yours. This is open to the public. We're going to have 6 dynamic panelists, some of whom you've heard from today, some of whom you'll meet tomorrow as moderators. And we're going to have a conversation. And this is unscripted. We're going to put them up here, 6 of them. Julian Bickersteth, please stand up. He is the president of IIC. He will be the moderator for this dialogue. Now, I have to say that, I do have a dog in the race here, because I am Director of Communications for the International Institute of Conservation, as well as one of the vice presidents there. And I am so proud to be a part of the Smithsonian and what we're doing today, and so proud to be a part of organizations such as the AIC and the IIC, and all the other major organizations that are here starting to have these major moments where we're really stepping up to the plate. And so I welcome you all to step forward with us. And I thank you for being here today, and I especially thank all of our amazing speakers and our moderators tomorrow. You're going to find a whole other group of remarkable people ready there to work with you, both as our moderators and the subject matter specialists who will be participating from the hosting institutions. I thank those hosting institutions. I thank my director. I thank the National Collections Program and the Provost's Office for supporting the funding to bring these remarkable speakers to you today, and the remarkable moderators you'll meet tomorrow. So again, a round of applause, please, for everyone involved. So now I leave you all to a lovely evening in Washington, D.C. area, and a lot of thinking, and I look forward to hearing all the stories from tomorrow. Thank you so much.